you for joining us today. Today's topic is cannabinoid-based medicines in the fight against epilepsy. Epilepsy is one of the most common neurological diseases affecting nearly 65 million people worldwide and is ranked by the WHO as a burdensome global neurological disorder. Despite the availability of 28 different pharmaceutical drugs, nearly 1 in 3 patients are drug resistant and do not achieve seizure freedom. Today, we are joined by Avicanna, who has established a multifaceted approach to develop and delivering cannabinoid-based products that incorporate drug development, preclinical research, real-world, and anecdotal evidence. Key partnerships with leading research institutions have allowed them to develop and advance their pharmaceutical pipeline, and including potential treatments for epilepsy. Today, we are joined by Carolina Urban and Aras from Avicanna. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Jeremy.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. So just a little bit about the two speakers. Carolina Urban is the Vice President of Scientific and Medical Affairs. Applying her scientific and business expertise, Dr. Urban, Vice President of Scientific and Medical Affairs, leads the development and execution of Avicanna's preclinical and clinical research programs. Dr. Urban also leads educational and scientific support for healthcare providers, including the development of educational resources and programs. Previously, she was in private equity space and responsible for scientific due diligence and potential investments, and responsible for supporting the business growth of the portfolio companies. Dr. Urban has an MSc in Neurological Sciences and PhD in Rehabilitation Sciences from the University of Toronto, with expertise in neuroimaging and brain injury. She is a former professional hockey player, winning the Clarkson Cup in the CWHL and an academic All-Canadian. Currently, she is on the board of scientific advisors of Mindspan, a brain analytics company, and a member of the board of directors for Conard Child and Family Services Foundation. And many of you are also familiar with Aras. He's the CEO of Avicanna. Utilizing his extensive and senior management experience in both finance and biotech sectors, Aras has co-founded Avicanna with the vision of establishing a biopharmaceutical company with a strict focus on medical and pharmaceutical applications of cannabinoids. His experience and expertise in the biotech industry have been integral to Avicanna's thought leadership pertaining to R&D and clinical development. Since 2016, Aras has successfully led a team of executive scientists, medical professionals across several countries with the vision of vertical integration and strong company focus on quality controls, scientific vigor, and competitive advantages. Aras holds a Bachelor's of Economics degree from York University and an International Master's in Management degree from EAD Business School in Barcelona, Spain. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, so we want to go ahead and jump to the slides.
Yeah, so Carolina will take the lead. I'll be here obviously to answer some questions, but this is really her project and her expertise. So Carolina, please go ahead.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. Excited to talk about this topic, especially around epilepsy, which has received a lot of attention in the cannabinoid-based medicine space. And yet there's still some challenges in having different types of drug available for various different epilepsy syndromes and types. And really at Avicanna here, we focused on both drug discovery, our medical cannabis division, and also using what we have learned in the space to drive some of our research. I will outline that in the later half of the presentation, but really I want to set the stage for epilepsy and why it's particularly an important indication that really does deserve a lot more attention. Next slide. In terms of what Jeremy started off with, is there's nearly 65 million people worldwide that have epilepsy. And really, when you think of epilepsy, it's really a disorder of the brain that's due to an abnormal and excessive electrical discharge. So those types of discharges actually lead to seizures. And there are various subtypes of seizures that can occur. when we look at the types of seizures that have the most economic burden and typically are associated with a lot of stigmatization. Individuals, for example, have a low quality of life as well as have challenges with everyday tasks. For some, they may have seizures many times a day. Others might have seizures where they don't necessarily make it obvious, but have more what you call a silent seizure. And when we think of these types of seizures, they have many different clinical manifestations, which makes it very difficult from a treatment perspective. Next slide. In terms of the types of seizures, just to give you a good idea of the different subtypes, what we have is a generalized onset seizure. These are actually spontaneous seizures that can affect both hemispheres of the brain. This group of seizures consists of absence seizures, which are, for example, disrupted awareness, or tonic-clonic seizures, which are associated with the most typically known body jerks and loss of consciousness. In contrast, another type of seizure is called a focal onset seizure. This one originates within one hemisphere, and the clinical expression depends on the area of brain from which the seizure originates. So, for example, one example of focal onset seizure is focal impaired awareness seizure. In this type, you have individuals who experience altered conscious state. Lastly, seizures can also be classified within the unknown onset category when the area of origin is unknown and the seizure is difficult to classify. Here, it's either due to a lack of knowledge or an abnormal state of mind, making it very difficult to understand where the seizure is coming from and subsequently how to treat it. In terms of the treatment of seizures, there are currently over 28 FDA-approved anti-epileptic drugs. Many of these target specific syndromes of epilepsy, so where you have a specific set of medical features that appear together. For example, some may have common triggers, some may have associated genetic factors, and are in response to and what's difficult is how do you select an anti-epileptic drug specific for a particular syndrome. Some common types of syndromes, such as the most common one that we have heard of in the cannabinoid space that does have a FDA-approved CBD-based drug, is called Dravet or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is a type of early childhood seizure. Other types might include childhood absence epilepsy, or even, for example, West syndrome. Now, these are the types of syndromes that have these common occurrences, but there are also other types of epilepsies that may not be generalized to a particular type of syndrome, which makes it even more difficult to treat. The targets of these anti-epileptic drugs vary by both the molecular or cellular pathways which can be targeted. For example, as mentioned in the types of subtypes, when you have one that might be in one type of area of the brain, it might have a different molecular cellular pathway that you would need to target. However, one of the most challenging things about epilepsy and treating of epilepsy is that the etiology of epilepsy is complex and it's multifactorial. Thus, really, when we think about it, the ideal anticonvulsant drug would be one that engages multiple targets to help rebalance that electrical activity within the brain. And versus a lot of these anti-epileptic drugs that are specific to targeting one molecular or cellular pathway. So, for example, as you can see in this list, you have regulation of ion channels. Some act on enhancing synaptic inhibition. Others are responsible for reducing synaptic excitation, or others in inducing cerebral acidosis. Now, when it comes to specifically to cannabinoids, they have demonstrated a multitude of different targets that we'll speak a little bit about, and these are known to have that potential anti-seizure effects. In terms of how many individuals still struggle with epilepsy, so despite those 28 known AEDs, we call them, so anti-epileptic drugs, there's still nearly 30% of patients that exhibit drug resistance. So the current type of AEDs that are out there do not help these patients. And in addition, really, they can also hinder the quality of life. What we often see is that some patients will be taking 2 or 3 different anti-epileptic drugs, and as a result have many side effects that they cannot cope with, whether it's they're very sleepy, so they don't really want to get out of bed, but also really it does have an effect on the whole limbic system. So meaning that it could affect anxiety, depression, and these other symptoms that are common comorbidities with epilepsy. Now, this really does lay the groundwork for the potential of finding another novel anticonvulsant drugs. And as we will talk about, many families that have challenges with the current anti-epileptic drugs have turned to cannabis-based therapies and as alternative basis options for based on anecdotal reports. Now, there is a need to better understand these drugs to go through the pharmaceutical pipeline. And that's something that we at Avicanna have strived to do, is how do we better understand these different cannabinoids in terms of epilepsy. As mentioned, there is an FDA-approved drug currently called Epidiolex that is for Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome. But again, that only touches a certain subtype of individuals. Now, we have also seen that there's other types of cannabinoids that have shown particular effects. And what I want to draw on is this idea that in North America, for example, or in Canada specifically, we have the regulations allow us to have medical cannabis products available on the market and to study how these particular oils or sprays work in the context of epilepsy. And one thing that we've noticed is that it's not necessarily a one cannabinoid type drug that will make the difference, but there's potential for some individuals to need other cannabinoids to have an effect, which I will touch base on in the next few slides. But really, it does lead us to think about the potential anti-epileptic effects of these drugs and how we can better understand how cannabinoids have that effect. And just to highlight here, really, what we have seen is this multi-target effect that I spoke of a little bit earlier. So rather than cannabinoids being specific to one target, for example, let's say the serotonin receptors, here what we see is that cannabinoids can act on various types of targets. And that, in theory, would help from the multifactorial effect of epilepsy. Next slide. Now, as mentioned, that as the etiology is complex and multifactorial, what there has been is studies that have actually evaluated whether medical cannabis is useful for epilepsy. So in this Australian nationwide study, what they did was they surveyed families that were using medical cannabis for their for treating their epilepsy, and we found that between 15 to 13% of adults and children were actually using cannabis products for epilepsy without an authorization. And what those individuals reported was in adults a 90% reduction of seizures and a 71% reduction in children's seizures. What's really specific here that I want to point out is it was not Epidiolex. These are products that individuals were purchasing on the market that may have included other types of active components, such as a little bit of THC or other cannabinoids like CBG or CBC or CBN, as well as different types of terpenes that could have that beneficial effect. Now, what those individuals really highlighted was that, one, they were able to treat their epilepsy and manage the amount of seizures they were having. But also, what they really stressed was about the more favorable side effect profile than the standard anti-epileptic drugs that were previously given. And of course, when we think of this from a quality of life perspective and in conceptualizing different pharmaceutical products, there's one thing about treating a particular indication, but also how do we make sure that when we do make those pharmaceutical drugs, that it's also leading to a better quality of life for that individual. Next slide. Now that really does lead me to discussing the entourage effect. So as mentioned in the last study, we have a lot of individuals using different types of cannabis-based products, and they're seeing this effects. So this meta-analysis specifically looked at, well, what are people using and what are the effects that it's having? And what they found in a set of 399 individuals was that 64% of individuals, of patients reported a reduction in seizure frequency when they were using medical cannabis. Now, when they started to compare CBD-rich extracts, so meaning that it had more than just CBD, but other cannabinoids and terpenes, versus a purified CBD compound, the CBD-rich extracts were much more effective. The comparison was between 71% were effective in extracts versus 36% in purified CBD. And then, as well as they highlighted that in 40% of individuals, there was a decrease of 50% or more in seizure frequency. Now, what's interesting here is that there was no difference between CBD-rich extracts and purified CBD, still drawing attention to the fact that CBD itself has very significant benefits for anti-seizure effects. However, it seems that there's a subset of individuals that might need more than just CBD in the seizure treatment. And finally, when it comes to dosing, so one of the challenges with CBD is that it is not water soluble, and it takes quite a bit of it to be absorbed into the body to have these effects. And this is both an issue of the type of formulations that are being used. So, for example, very simple, basic oil-based, but also an example of why adding other cannabinoids or terpenes can help have an effective dose. So those that were using CBD-rich extracts on average used 6.1 kilograms per milligram versus 27.1 milligrams per kilogram, meaning that that's almost a 4.5 times more CBD being put into the body. And again, when we start to increase the amount of actives, you start to see the side effects grow. So if we can lower down the amount of cannabinoids that are being put in the body to have an effective dose, it will have a better outcome for that patient and that quality of life. Next slide. Now that brings me to what we're doing as Avicanna, and really I want to highlight 4 different bins. First being the development of advanced formulations. As mentioned in the previous slide, one of the challenges has been that a lot of these products that are out there are very simplified formulations, and these formulations lack the product stability, lack the ability to increase the amount of cannabinoids that are being absorbed into the body. In many circumstances, we have physicians telling us, well, we actually don't know how much a patient is taking, or if they're taking what is actually on the label. And then that leads to the challenge of, is it easy to use for an individual? So all of this is something that Avicanna has built into our pharmaceutical pipeline. And really this started with our connection to the University of Toronto, which is one of the leading academic institutions in Canada, and the Faculty of Pharmacy there, where we had the team begin developing our advanced delivery platform, and now internally led by Dr. Franz Ledevidek, to develop these types of formulations that are advanced, that increase the cannabinoid stability and as well as the bioavailability, so that we're getting the most outcome for a patient. In addition, these advanced delivery forms are very important because you want that patient to get a specific profile. So, for example, you wouldn't want a patient one to be using an inhalable product to get their CBD or THC. So you would have to create an oral delivery format. But two, you want it to, for example, last for a long time. So to do that, you need to create these formulations that have a slow release into the body. In addition to that, what we take there, we apply into our R&D and medical commercialization. So from the medical commercialization that I'll speak to, which is in the middle, we have actually commercialized many of these products into medical cannabis in Canada. This actually is a great way for us to gather more data around which products work, what cannabinoid concentrations work for patients, but as well as better understand the type of doses that patients need. And in particular, we have many formulations that are being used right now on the medical cannabis market for patients with epilepsy. That allows us to better understand these effects and as well as drive that information back into our drug discovery and preclinical work. So, for example, right now we're working with Dr. Peter Carlin, studying the in vitro, so the cellular work to understand what mechanisms of action, so where are these cannabinoids specifically working, and as well as in vivo, we apply it to in vivo models to study the anti-seizure effects of these compounds. But what's critical here is that we're not just studying CBD alone. We're actually studying these other cannabinoids to better understand the combinations that lead to the most effective efficacy for particular types of seizure syndromes. In addition, these products, as they're launched onto these medical cannabis platforms, are also enrolled in real-world evidence study that not only gives us that anecdotal evidence, but allows us to quantify the type of effects that these products are having. So whether it be, is that patient's quality of life improving? Do they have a lower amount of seizures? And again, what's particularly important is what dose works. It also allows us to identify, well, let's say for a particular subset of epilepsy, we see that a specific product is working with a specific ratio. So when we go back into that preclinical and clinical pipelines, we can better identify the type of syndromes that we will be focusing on. Again, in that regard, it helps us really bypass a lot of that pharmaceutical long-term investment that often fails once you get to phase 2 and phase 3 because of the lack of real-world evidence. Now, finally, and we will talk about this more in conversation, we have also our own vertical integration where we've been able to take one of our particular products and commercialize it under pharmaceutical drug preparation, which will be pending, which is right now pending market authorization in different countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, and Brazil. And what's really key here is that this is using our own purified CBD from our cultivation site and meets the that is met under the GMP standards with a full technical dossier. In this regard, we are also able to commercialize this in other places in the world, and again with those pharmaceutical partners that we've announced over the past year, allows us to study these types of products in particular indications and go to those clinical phase 2, phase 3 studies that we are excited to start. So I'm going to stop there, and I want to thank everyone for joining and opening up the chat to Jeremy and Aras.
Perfect. Okay, got a number of questions for you guys. Just 1 second here. All right, so the three of us are back up. So I think this is great that you guys are, charting ahead and trying to solve these real world problems, especially with epilepsy. I have a cousin She has it, and she was not able to drive, and I could see the impact it had on her life. Where being a mom, she was just limited in a lot of the things she could do as an adult, and how frustrating that was for her. So it's great to see people looking at different approaches to try to solve some of these medical challenges that exist. So a couple of questions out here. Thank you for. Can you talk a little bit more about your product? Can you give everybody the proper pronunciation and where it's found right now?
So right now I'll start with the Row Phyto Microdrop 50. That one's commercialized under medical cannabis in Canada. That product has been utilized with a lot of neurologists, particularly for pediatric epilepsy and as well as adult epilepsy patients. So that one's available in Canada where they get an authorization and they can purchase the products under medical cannabis by shoppers. And as well as Trinarox, which I'll let Aras talk a little bit about Trinarox because I think he can talk about the commercial side of it.
Yeah,
Perfect.
we'll do it. Well, maybe just before I get into specifically Trunox, I think it's important for the audience to understand the potential, the role, and the existing evidence that Carolina alluded to in terms of epilepsy and other neurological disorders. I think there's two major misconceptions I think related to cannabis. One, that the benefits of cannabis are done through inhalation, and all of our products are not inhalation. Second is that it's a little bit of it's more of theoretical or anecdotal that cannabis actually has real therapeutic effects in terms of major clinical indications and or real therapeutic effect in terms of actual diseases. And I think what GW Pharmaceuticals did as a pioneer with getting their first FDA approved drug, or what Carolina was alluding to in terms of the experience we've had with patients, is that it is real medicine. And we've been for the last 7 years advocating for the separation of medical and recreational. And I think taking the cannabis plant and pulling the cannabinoids and turning those into specific compounds and specific formulations has substantial opportunity. And not only are we starting to see it, but the FDA has already approved one, and there's products such as Trunerex that are on their pathway of getting approvals. So to kind of segue that into Trunerex, it is a 10% CBD formulation. It is, from a dose perspective, equivalent to GW Pharmaceuticals Epidiolex. The product has been submitted for drug approval in a number of South American countries, including Ecuador, Brazil, which is obviously a large market, but countries like Colombia as well. We believe that the product will be approved within the next few months in at least 2 out of the 3 of those countries, where it will be offered as a prescription drug for epilepsy. So again, anecdotal evidence and sort of people assumptions around cannabis only being benefit for particular diseases or being beneficial through inhalation, we're way past that stage, right? And I think we're way past the stage where all companies within cannabinoids are the same. And I think what we're presented today in terms of epilepsy research, epilepsy products, is to demonstrate sort of the pathway we've taken and the potential these products have to really helping people, right? And that's kind of where, again, Trunerex is well positioned. We'll be starting off in South America and ultimately looking to launch some of our epilepsy pipeline drugs in other markets as well. So that's sort of my rant. I know I went on, but trying to start with answering your question, but happy to address the other ones.
Okay, the next one is for our audience. Can you kind of give some insight on just how tedious the FDA process is for the CBD epilepsy drugs?
Do you want to take a crack, Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, yes, the FDA process is very tedious, right? You have your preclinical research that you have to go through and into the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. However, because CBD is already approved through the FDA, there are other pathways that can be taken. That isn't to say that the FDA is the only end all and be all. There are other opportunities like the EMA in Europe that actually it stands on the same platform as FDA. So if you get an EMA approval, you can actually get an FDA approval quite fast. And sometimes to add there, you can go through other countries to go through the whole pharmaceutical development pipeline at a more efficient or cost-effective pathway to be able to get that approval on FDA. And as well as you have different legislations in place, such as Brazil, for example, that allows you to study these products into phase 2, phase 3 right away because of the regulations that they've established, which is actually a very clever way in that you can study not only epilepsy but other indications under RDC 327 that allows you to launch right away.
And I just want to add a couple of things, Jeremy. Again, I'm gonna take this back, kind of for the audience
Sure.
to recreational versus pharmaceutical in this case. When you're selling a recreational product, you're growing flower generally. You're drying the flower, you're putting it in a package, and you're selling it. You're testing it, you're making sure it's free of pesticides, herbicides, whatever, heavy metals, residual solvent, etc., and you're selling it. When you're talking about a pharmaceutical product, and whether, as Carolina said, whether that's FDA or other regulations, this is a product that, first of all, needs to go through a certain level of testing in terms of the active pharmaceutical ingredients. That ingredient needs to go through stability. Then that particular product needs to go through good manufacturing practices of manufacturing, which is all validated protocols. Product needs to go through stability. Then it needs to have a proper technical dossier. All these things take years. And that's why that product, once it's approved, in addition to the technical information, the pharmacological information, which is the clinical trials, once that product is approved, that's a drug that you can now buy at a pharmacy and physicians can prescribe. It's a very different process, right? And one of the benefits we face, or in terms of being, involved with cannabinoids, is that because cannabinoids and cannabis have history of use for thousands of years, because they're safe in terms of toxicity profiles, again, generally speaking, we were able to bypass many of that in many countries. So in countries like Canada, it's federally legal. In countries like Brazil, as Carolina said, because we know cannabinoids work and we know they're safe, it's just about the accurate dose, the appropriate delivery. If we do the work, which we have, we're able to bypass a lot of that and actually go through a much faster process of drug approval, even within the FDA in the US, as you typically would with a new compound, a newly discovered compound, for example. So the process is cumbersome, but obviously it's worth the process. We think and given that we already have signals and we already see efficacy with the products already with patients, we're not going into our studies blind. We're actually going into our studies knowing what works and what may not work. So it's a very, very exciting sort of space to be on, but it's one that, again, companies like Avicanna are qualified to lead. And I unfortunately, I don't believe many of the recreational companies are. And that's why they should focus on the recreational side, right? And again, hence the separation that I think is necessary.
Agreed. Have they figured out why 30 to 40% still have refractory epilepsy? And can you kind of explain what refractory epilepsy means for the audience?
Yeah, so refractory epilepsy is individuals that don't get relief from the current anti-epileptic drugs. And that's where the opportunity lies for individuals to try cannabinoids. Of course, it won't work for everyone, but there is a very big subset of individuals that get relief from cannabinoid-based medicines for these conditions that are considered refractory epilepsy. So when it comes to it, still the standard clinical approach is to try these anti-epileptic drugs. And after trying a certain subset of them, you would then potentially try a cannabinoid-based product.
Okay. What are some of the reasons that, on a technical level, that CBD has shown to be more beneficial? Do you know?
Yeah, so one of the reasons is its multifactorial aspect of epilepsy, where CBD has different targets it binds to. So we kind of think of it as, it's not one binding one specific target, but it is working on multiple. And that's where the complexities of the brain come into play. To date, most of the studies that have been done around pharmaceutical development do target just one target, so one receptor. But what we're starting to understand is that the brain itself has many different types of actions, mechanisms, cellular pathways, neural pathways. So we need to be able to target multiple of them to help with different anti-seizure effects. That's not to say that for maybe a specific type of epilepsy, you only need one type of target, but with this, for example, the refractory epilepsy, because it is multifactorial and it has many different cellular pathways that are being affected, it gives the potential for cannabinoids to target some of those pathways.
So you mentioned more favorable side effects. Can you explain what are the negative side effects people typically see, just for the audience, and then kind of talk about the more favorable ones with these CBD products?
Yeah, so for example, with any type of drug that you take a lot of, you'll see disruptions in cognitive abilities, the ability to think. You might become drowsy. Some individuals with some of the standard anti epileptic drugs have a difficult time concentrating, sleeping, even effects on appetite, as well as there could be an impact on their psychology, so in terms of anxiety or depression, because they're not feeling like they can go and do something. But in terms of cannabinoids, what we do see in general is that uh, because of this multifactorial effect, so it works on multiple receptors, that you actually may have less side effects. And that's in fact what we hear from a lot of patients. And to add there, once these formulations become more, I guess, better in terms of their advancement, then you'll also see a decrease in the type of symptoms that might occur when you take a lot of CBD. So there is some known literature that shows that when you take CBD a very high concentration, because of the liver working to metabolize it, you might have side effects such as nausea. But these new formulations, as they become more advanced, mean that there'll be less CBD going in and hopefully having more better effects with less CBD, thus less side effects.
Okay, so you said there's obviously other companies making CBD solutions. Can you compare how or contrast how the Avicanna products are different?
Yeah, so for one, the advancement of our formulations. So these aren't just simple oil-based formulations. We actually have a very advanced scientific platform where we're creating formulations that have better dose delivery, better bioavailability and absorption, as well as stability. So now you're talking about a better product for that patient. But also in our discovery pipeline with our partners, we're evaluating other cannabinoids and terpenes that might have benefits for epilepsy and evaluating the combination of them. So, not just alone, again, adding to that multi target type of approach to see what is the best type of combination in our formulations for these epilepsy syndromes.
The two words that keep seeming to come up are stability and absorption. I remember when we spoke offline, you mentioned stability, and oftentimes many of the competitors offer their product through like MTC oil,
MCT.
MCT.
Yeah, it's just coconut oil, right? I mean, again, I think it goes back to the recreational companies seeing an opportunity for CBD products. So they extract CBD, they put it into an oil tincture with just coconut oil,
Mm,
and that's 99% of the market product in the market. So that doesn't have what we would call pharmaceutical grade in terms of testing, quality assurance, manufacturing standards. And I think that's Carolina's point. Again, as when you're selling to recreational people and to a recreational channel, I think it's a consumer's choice. When you sell a bottle of tequila, it doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't come with the same level of standards as when you sell medicine to a pediatric patient, right? And
right.
that's where we consistently insist on a separation between medical and recreational, and that goes all the way down to the product. And it is the quality of the product, the standard, the formulation, which is using an actual drug delivery system, not just, hey, let's pour some extract into coconut oil. But in addition to that, it's the evidence, right? It's leveraging off of existing evidence, but also generating our own. We're coming up with formulations and doses and ratios based on preclinical evidence, based on drug delivery in vitro evidence, and then we're putting those into actual studies with patient populations, so we can not only generate the sufficient evidence to ensure we have the right products, but then to be able to use that evidence to educate the medical community. Because Jeremy, your typical neurologist still today, you know, from a population, high proportion perspective, is going to say, well, I'm not open to this
Mm.
unless you have the drug evidence, the clinical evidence. And in markets like Canada, United States, we're seeing a little bit more support. We're seeing a little bit more, progression in terms of physicians seeing the benefits. But without that evidence, you're not going to turn the page on that, right? And that's, I think, the difference with our products is, yes, they're advanced, they're at a pharmaceutical level, but also they're backed by evidence.
So I like to make sure everybody understands like every little detail that they're unclear on. So you spoke about the oils or a lot of other people's delivery mechanism. Can you tell our audience about your delivery mechanisms?
So maybe I can start. I mean, we look at delivering cannabinoids as a drug, and depending on the clinical pathology or the utility of the product, the delivery mechanism is different. As an
Mhm.
example, if we're talking about a dermatology indication, that would be a cream that is designed
Mhm.
from a pH, from a viscosity, from a sort of formulation perspective to stay on the skin, because that's
Mhm.
where treatment needs to happen, whether that's eczema or a rare skin disease that we're actually focused on called epidermolysis bullosa. Or if you're talking about something, for example, that is deeper into the joints and muscles, let's say you're looking at pain,
Mhm.
osteoarthritis, that may be a product that is designed to obviously have deeper penetration and to be still a topical. So again, it's not an inhalation product, right? If someone has a skin disease that cannabinoids may treat, you're not going to smoke a joint to relieve that. And we've gone past that and we're designing actual delivery systems for that. If you're talking about something that is more acute pain, you need faster response. Maybe the right solution for that is a sublingual delivery, a sublingual spray, which gets right into sort of the blood and it bypasses first pass metabolism. And we have products that are designed for that in the market, and we have more advanced versions of it, including sublingual tablets that will be coming out in 2023. So again, you look at the clinical pathology, you look at the most optimal delivery mechanism, you look at the most optimal cannabinoid ratio, and that's what we've been developing. But the exciting part is that's what we've been delivering to patients over the past 2 years, right? So it's not just a pipeline, it's not just theoretical biotechnology. At this stage, we're more of a biopharma company that's actually delivering products into the market.
And the delivery mechanisms for these epilepsy drugs is which type?
So they are oral delivery. So it would be, for example, a tincture that an individual takes.
Mm.
However, there are other ingredients in there that help increase the bioavailability as well as the stability of the product. What's really key there too is that the cannabinoids actually have what pharmacologists would call as a high log P, meaning that they're quite big in size. So you
Mm.
can't just put it into a basic formulation and expect it to be absorbed well. So what these formulations are called are microemulsions. So they actually disperse the molecules throughout the fluids and increase the absorption by getting into very tiny little specks. Whereas when you imagine an oil-based formulation, what you see are actually full droplets if you were to drop it into a, for example, glass of water. So that's how we work to get into those smaller sizes or small particle sizes to increase the absorption.
Very interesting. So you spoke about other cannabinoids that you guys are looking at. What are some of the other ones y'all are excited about?
So we're working on various ones. Some of these are more rare,
Okay.
and I won't disclose them at this time. However, we do see benefits of whether it's less is needed to have an effect, or as well as whether it has that entourage effect. And again, this is going through that same kind of pipeline where we're studying it in vivo, then in vitro, and then optimizing the formulation itself. We're particularly excited about this because right now we see a lot of individuals that do have effects with their products, but there's still a subset of individuals that have refractory epilepsy and as well as other neurological disorders that we could study with these various cannabinoids. So as we better understand these cannabinoids, we'll be able to apply it to various indications beyond just epilepsy as well.
Just something to add there, Jeremy. It's the cannabis plant is very interesting, right? It is essentially a biological factory that produces terpenoids and cannabinoids. And on one end of the spectrum, from a research perspective, Carolina and our R&D team are working with some of the biggest academic institutions in Canada, where we're testing individual compounds, whether that's CBD, CBG, CBC, THC, THCV. There's several of those compounds,
Mm-hmm.
and we're testing individually to see what each one of them does in particular disease setting. And then, as she said, we would combine them in various ratios to try to find proprietary synergistic ratios, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
On the other end of the spectrum, we do have our own cultivation project in Colombia, and because our cost of cultivation is very low, we are able to do a lot of pheno hunting and a lot of breeding projects, which is
Mm.
our cultivation team. They're experts in genetics, and what we're trying to do there is to breed plants with DNA-led sort of sequencing to then express those cannabinoids. So typically, historically, we've been breeding cannabis plants to be very high in CBD or very high in THC, and now we're trying to breed plants without genetically modifying them to actually express some of what used to be called a rare cannabinoid. Like we've been able to accomplish that with CBG already, and we're working with some other ones. So on one end, we're testing what they do so we can come up with the formulations for right diseases. On the other end, we're actually trying to breed so that we can have these mini factories that are going to produce those cannabinoids so we can produce them organically and sustainably as well. So it's fascinating what the potential of this plant is. And I think we're just in the earlier stages, really only talking about CBD and THC.
So that was kind of hitting to my next question was, what were you guys excited about with the future and what opportunities you saw? You kind of just hinted at it. Are there any other things you're excited about and the future opportunities you guys are seeing?
Yeah, so something maybe I can say is I think it's a very exciting phase to be able to commercialize, which we have done, medical cannabis, which is standardized products with accurate dosing, and to do so with a very large patient population. So today, for example, our products are available under Medical Cannabis by Shoppers Drug Mart, which is the largest pharmacy chain in Canada. So there's about 33,000 patients that have access to our products. And as we evolve that platform, as we evolve through that process, and we can learn what the 33,000 people are benefiting in terms of which disease, what dose, what ratio, it will provide us with significant information to educate physicians, to educate insurance companies and convince them that they should be covering this because it's going to reduce their other expenses or short-term, long-term disability, to educate ourselves in our clinical trials. So when Carolina and the team proceed into a phase 2, phase 3, we go in knowing specifically what dose, what ratio works for what disease. And we are always surprised by the outcomes from the real world evidence studies, which is what we call, the medical cannabis, or kind of like a phase 4, where you're learning where your product works, because you get these particular diseases or particular cohorts of patients that come and say, this really worked very well for us. And this is not something we might have thought about. So I'm very excited through the discovery phase of real world evidence to see where the potential of more standardized medical cannabis is, and then to be able to evolve that from an education perspective, to expand it internationally, but to be able to translate that into a pharmaceutical drug. That entire combination is fascinating, and it's very specific to what you can do with cannabinoids only.
We spoke early on about there being 65 million people worldwide. How is that distributed in the world? Is that mostly in Western countries? Like, what do those stats look like?
Typically, it's between 1 to 2% of the population will have epilepsy. And one of the opportunities, too, that, when you think of cannabinoid-based medicine and us having our own cultivation, it allows us to have drugs, pharmaceutical drugs that could be used in populations that can't afford these very expensive drugs that went through a long pharmaceutical pipeline. So there's really an opportunity that's unique here in that we could deliver drugs not just in North America and Europe, but also all around the world. And really, as more places in the world undergo medical legalization for cannabis, it gives us the opportunity to be that first one in using what we've learned in Canada to apply worldwide, which is particularly exciting. So I think epilepsy is just a start. Epilepsy has a lot of comorbidities such as anxiety, depression, appetite issues that we are also better understanding through our studies, and allows us to apply to various populations.
Okay. Is there anything else you guys want to let the audience know?
A lot of exciting developments coming up as again we expand. One of the I think core things is, the United Nations Convention on Narcotics does not permit the export of recreational cannabis. So we as a company today, we are proud to say we've been active in 18 international markets, which includes Canada and the United States. But as more and more legislation opens up to allow for cannabis-based medicine and cannabis-based pharmaceuticals, we're going to be opening those opportunities, looking to collaborate with the local medical community, but also to commercialize. So it's a very, very exciting phase for the medical side of the industry. While I think a little bit of the wind has been removed from the sail of the recreational side, I think people are, in my opinion, mistakenly mixing the two sides of the sector. So I would just say stay tuned to see the real potential and the progress that we continue to make on the medical side.
So it's fair to say that the cannabis sector has been overlooked by some because of the hype and disappointment around some of these recreational products. But now is the perfect time for these real opportunities that are solving real issues and creating better outcomes, right?
Absolutely, like real products that are really solving real therapeutic indications or and these are not, if something is working for your kid's epilepsy, you're not going to come the next day and try a different product. Like if it's working, that's the product you stick with, and you cannot compare that to a recreational product, right? And I think that and a lot of investors were mistreated, a lot of people money has been lost, so we can all appreciate that, but I think this part is being overlooked. Absolutely.
All right. Can you give everybody how they can contact you?
Info@avicanna.com, and on LinkedIn, Carolina and I both are available. We're quite vocal and active across social media and across various channels. But everything, all the information we presented is also in our presentation, and lots of videos that will be available through our YouTube page as well.
And we'll have this video on our site. And then if anybody needs help getting in contact with both of them, I am the person you can contact, and I'll get your info to them. So thanks, everybody. Any final words from either of you?
Thanks for your time, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All righty.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.